Christmas Eve 1847. The Harrove plantation in northern Louisiana stood silent under a moonless sky. Inside the main house, candles flickered behind frosted windows as the family prepared for midnight mass. But in the quarters behind the cotton fields, a woman named Ruth held her 3 children close, whispering promises she knew she could not keep. By dawn, her family would be scattered across 3 different states, sold to settle gambling debts their master had accumulated in New Orleans. What the Hargroves did not know was that Ruth had been keeping her own ledger. And over the next 6 years, every name written in that ledger would meet an ending local authorities struggled to explain. Before we continue with the story of Ruth and the Harrove plantation, if you're hearing this from Louisiana, Mississippi, or anywhere in the South, leave a comment telling us what state you're from. Hit that subscribe button, because stories like this, buried in courthouse records and family whispers, don't get told often enough. The separation happened quickly, as these things always did, but the events leading to that Christmas Eve had been building for years. Like pressure behind a dam, waiting for the moment when everything would break. The Harrove plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of rich bottomland along the Red River, where the soil ran dark as coffee grounds and cotton grew tall enough to hide a man. The main house, a Greek Revival structure with 6 white columns and a widow's walk, had been built in 1832 by Thomas Hargrove's father, Jonathan Hargrove, back when cotton prices were high and the future seemed limitless. Jonathan had been a shrewd businessman, calculating and cold, who built his fortune through careful investments and ruthless efficiency. He died in 1843, leaving everything to his only son, Thomas, along with a reputation that cast a long shadow. Thomas Hargrove had inherited not just the land, but also his father's taste for cards and whiskey, though none of his father's discipline or business acumen. Where Jonathan had been methodical, Thomas was impulsive. Where Jonathan had been calculating, Thomas was reckless. The plantation that had thrived under Jonathan's management began to show strain under Thomas's leadership. Fields that should have been rotated were planted with cotton year after year, depleting the soil. Equipment that should have been maintained was left to rust. Debts that should have been paid accumulated like storm clouds on the horizon. By 1847, Thomas had been running the plantation for 4 years, and the cracks were beginning to show. The cotton yield was down 15% from the previous year. 3 field hands had died from fever over the summer, reducing the workforce. The overseer, a brutal man named Silas Crenshaw, had quit after a dispute over wages, taking with him years of experience managing the labor force. And Thomas's gambling debts, accumulated during monthly trips to New Orleans, had grown to the point where creditors were beginning to make demands that could not be ignored. Ruth had been born on the Harrove property in 1815, the daughter of a woman named Esther, who'd been brought from Virginia in a coffle when she was just 16. Esther had never spoken much about her life before Louisiana, but sometimes late at night, she'd sing songs in a language Ruth did not understand, songs that sounded like grief-given voice. Esther died when Ruth was 12, worn out by years of field work and childbearing, leaving Ruth with memories of gentle hands and a voice that could make even the saddest songs sound like hope. Ruth learned to read by watching the Hargrove children during their lessons, memorizing letters through a crack in the schoolroom door. This was dangerous knowledge, forbidden knowledge, but Ruth's mother had encouraged it before she died. "Words are weapons," she'd whispered during one of their last conversations, her hand gripping Ruth's with surprising strength. "You just have to know when to use them. And you have to be patient. Patient like water wearing down stone. You understand me?" Ruth understood. And she had been patient. She'd been moved from fieldwork to the main house when she was 14, after Margaret Hargrove noticed her nimble fingers and quick mind. Margaret needed a seamstress, someone who could mend endless tears and worn spots in the family's clothing, someone who could create the elaborate dresses Margaret wore to church and social gatherings. Ruth proved herself capable, and more than that, she proved herself invisible. She could sit in the corner of the parlor for hours, sewing quietly while the Hargroves and their guests talked, and they'd forget she was there. She became part of the furniture, as unremarkable as the grandfather clock in the hall or the portrait of Jonathan Hargrove above the fireplace. And while she sewed, she listened. She learned about debts and creditors, about gambling losses and business failures, about the complex web of relationships and obligations that bound the white families of Louisiana together. She learned who owed money to whom, who held grudges, who had secrets they wanted kept hidden. She learned that information was a kind of currency, and she began to collect it the way a miser collects coins. Ruth married Samuel in 1838 in a ceremony that had no legal standing but meant everything to them. Samuel was a blacksmith on the neighboring Pritchard plantation, a man with hands scarred by years of working hot metal, with shoulders broad from swinging hammers, with a quiet strength Ruth found comforting. They'd met at a corn shucking, one of the few social gatherings where enslaved people from different plantations could mingle, and Ruth had been drawn to his steady presence, his careful way of speaking, his refusal to be broken by the circumstances of his life. Their marriage existed in the spaces between work and sleep, in stolen hours on Sunday afternoons when Samuel would walk the 3 miles between plantations, in letters Ruth would write and Samuel would carry back, folded small and hidden in his shoe. They built a life in those spaces, fragile and precious, always aware it could be taken away at any moment. Their children, Daniel, born in 1838, Grace, born in 1841, and baby Thomas, born in 1846, represented a future Ruth fought to imagine despite the circumstances that defined their lives. She'd named the baby after Thomas Hargrove, a strategic decision she hoped might offer some protection. If the master saw his own name reflected in the child, perhaps he'd be less likely to sell him. It was a small hope, but Ruth had learned to survive on small hopes. Samuel would walk the 3 miles between plantations every Sunday, the one day he could call his own. He'd bring small gifts, a carved wooden horse for Daniel, a cloth doll for Grace, a smooth river stone for baby Thomas to teethe on. They'd spend those precious hours together in Ruth's cabin, building a family within a system designed to prevent exactly that. Samuel would tell stories about the work he'd done that week, about the horses he'd shod and the tools he'd mended. Ruth would share news from the Hargrove household, carefully edited to remove anything too painful or frightening. The children would play, their laughter a brief respite. Those Sundays were everything. They were the reason Ruth got up each morning, the reason she kept going when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. They were proof that love could exist even in the darkest places, that family could be built even when the law said it didn't exist. The Hargrove household consisted of Thomas, his wife Margaret, and their 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Caroline. Margaret ran the house with rigid efficiency, her days measured in menus and social calls, in church services and charity work that allowed her to feel virtuous without actually changing anything. She treated Ruth with the distant courtesy one might show a useful piece of furniture, necessary but not quite worthy of genuine attention. She'd compliment Ruth's sewing, would occasionally give her cast-off clothing or leftover food, would even ask after her children in the abstract way one might ask about someone's pets. But she never saw Ruth as fully human, never considered that Ruth might have thoughts and feelings as complex as her own. Thomas barely noticed the enslaved people on his property unless they failed to perform their duties. To him, they were investments, assets to be calculated in ledgers alongside livestock and equipment. He knew their monetary value down to the dollar, could recite their ages and skills and market prices, but he could not have told you their hopes or fears or dreams. They were tools that happened to be made of flesh, and he treated them accordingly. But Thomas Hargrove had a problem his father's fortune couldn't solve. He could not walk away from a card table. Every month he'd travel to New Orleans, ostensibly on business, but everyone knew he spent his nights in the gambling houses along Bourbon Street. He'd return either flush with winnings or silent with loss, and the mood of the entire plantation would shift accordingly. When he won, he'd be generous, allowing extra rations or time off, walking through the quarters with the magnanimous air of a king bestowing favors. When he lost, he'd be cold and distant, finding fault with everything, increasing work quotas and reducing privileges. The enslaved people on the Hargrove plantation learned to read the signs of his gambling trips the way sailors read the weather. They'd watch him leave, noting his mood and the weight of his money purse, and they'd make predictions about what his return would bring. More often than not in recent years, his returns had brought nothing good. In December 1847, Thomas returned from New Orleans with the kind of silence that precedes storms. He arrived late at night, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cold, his face drawn and pale in the lamplight. He went directly to his study without greeting his wife or daughters, and the sound of a whiskey bottle being opened echoed through the quiet house. Margaret stood in the hallway, her face tight with worry and anger, but she did not follow him. She'd learned over the years of their marriage that there were times when Thomas needed to be left alone with his demons. Ruth, sewing in the corner of the upstairs hallway where she could catch the last of the daylight, watched Margaret's face and knew something terrible was coming. She'd seen that expression before, that mixture of fear and resignation, and it never meant anything good for the people who had no power to protect themselves. The next few days were tense, the atmosphere in the main house thick with unspoken dread. Thomas stayed in his study, emerging only for meals, which he ate in silence while Margaret watched him with worried eyes. The daughters, Elizabeth and Caroline, sensed the tension and became quiet and subdued, their usual chatter replaced by whispers and nervous glances. Ruth first heard concrete news from Patience, Margaret's lady's maid, a woman who'd been on the Hargrove plantation for 20 years and had learned to read the signs of household disaster before they became obvious. Patience was 10 years older than Ruth, with gray threading through her hair and a network of fine lines around her eyes that spoke of years of careful observation. She'd survived by being useful and invisible, by knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, by understanding the complex dynamics of power that governed plantation life. "He lost big this time," Patience whispered while they folded linens in the upstairs hallway, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. The smell of lavender sachets filled the air, a scent that would forever be associated in Ruth's mind with this moment of terrible revelation. "I heard him and Miss Margaret arguing last night. Woke me up, they were so loud. He owes money to 3 different men. Serious money. The kind of money that can't be paid back with a good cotton harvest or by selling off equipment." Ruth's hands stilled on the sheet she was folding, the fabric suddenly feeling heavy as lead. "How much?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Patience glanced toward the stairs, making sure they were alone, then leaned closer. "I heard him say 15,000. Maybe more. He lost it all in one night playing faro with some men from Mobile. They gave him a month to pay, and that month is almost up. 15,000. The number was almost incomprehensible. Ruth tried to calculate what that meant, how many years of cotton harvest, how many assets would need to be sold, and she knew with a cold certainty that settled in her stomach like a stone what the most liquid assets on a plantation were. People, she thought. "He's talking about selling off assets," Patience continued, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was saying. "I heard him tell Miss Margaret that he'd have to make some difficult decisions, that sacrifices would have to be made. And Miss Margaret, she just cried and said she didn't want to know the details, that he should do what he had to do." Ruth felt something crack inside her chest, a physical sensation like ice breaking. But she kept her face calm, kept her hands steady as she resumed folding the sheet. She'd learned long ago not to show pain in front of anyone, even someone like Patience who might understand. Pain was weakness, and weakness could be exploited. "Do you know who?" Ruth asked, though she already knew the answer. She could feel it in her bones, in the way her heart had started to beat faster, in the cold sweat that had broken out along her spine. Patience's eyes met Ruth's, and unspoken understanding passed between them. "He's been looking at the ledgers, the ones that list everyone's value. I saw them on his desk when I was cleaning. Your Daniel's name was circled. And Grace's. And there were notes in the margins, numbers and names of potential buyers." Ruth nodded slowly, her mind already racing ahead, calculating possibilities, considering options. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I'm sorry," Patience whispered, and Ruth could see she meant it. They weren't friends exactly, friendship was a luxury enslaved people couldn't always afford, but they understood each other. They were both women trying to survive in a world that saw them as property, trying to protect what little they had in a system designed to take everything. That evening, Ruth stood at the window of her small cabin, watching her children sleep. The cabin was tiny, just one room with a dirt floor and walls made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. There was a fireplace at one end, currently burning low, casting flickering shadows across the space. A table and 2 chairs, both made by Samuel, stood against one wall. A rope bed with a thin mattress took up most of the remaining space, and a smaller pallet on the floor served as a bed for the children. Daniel lay on his side, one arm thrown over Grace, who clutched her cloth doll even in sleep. The doll had been made by Ruth from scraps of fabric, with button eyes and yarn hair, and Grace carried it everywhere, a small comfort in an uncertain world. Baby Thomas breathed softly in his cradle, his tiny fists curled near his face, his expression peaceful in sleep. He looked like Samuel, with the same broad forehead and strong jaw, and Ruth felt her heart constrict with love and fear. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and the cornbread Ruth had made for supper, mixed with the earthy smell of the dirt floor and the faint scent of the herbs she'd hung from the rafters to dry. Outside, the December cold had settled over the plantation, unusual for Louisiana, but not unheard of. Frost glittered on the cotton stalks that hadn't been cleared from the fields, and the air had a sharp, clean quality that made everything seem more vivid. Ruth tried to memorize this moment, the sound of her children breathing, the warmth of the fire, the feeling of safety she knew was about to be shattered. She tried to hold on to it, to store it away in her memory where it could never be taken from her. She heard footsteps approaching, heavy boots on frozen ground. The distinctive sound of a white man who didn't need to move quietly because he had nothing to fear. Her heart began to pound, but she kept her face calm, kept her breathing steady. She'd known this was coming. Patience's warning had given her time to prepare, at least mentally. The door opened without a knock. Thomas Hargrove stood in the doorway, his face flushed from whiskey, his eyes not quite meeting hers. He held a lantern in one hand, and the light cast strange shadows across his features, making him look older and more haggard than his 35 years. He wore his good coat, the one he reserved for business meetings and church, and Ruth understood that he dressed up for this, that he was trying to maintain some pretense of formality, of civilization, even as he prepared to destroy her family. "Ruth," he said, his voice carrying the false gentleness of someone about to inflict pain and hoping to be forgiven for it. "I need to speak with you about a business matter." She stood, smoothing her apron with hands that wanted to shake but didn't, and waited. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions. She'd learned that sometimes silence was the best strategy, that white people would fill silence with words, would reveal more than they intended if you just waited. "I've had some financial setbacks," he continued, still not looking directly at her, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "Nothing that can't be managed, but it requires some adjustments. I've arranged sales that will settle my debts and put the plantation back on solid footing. It's a temporary measure, you understand. Just until the next harvest comes in and cotton prices improve." Ruth's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Sales, sir." She made her tone respectful, subservient, the voice of someone who accepted her place in the world. It was a performance she'd perfected over years, a mask she could put on and take off as needed. "Daniel will go to a cotton plantation in Mississippi," Thomas said, the words coming faster now, as if he wanted to get them out quickly and be done with this unpleasant task. "The buyer specifically requested a strong young boy who can be trained in field work. He's offering a good price, very fair. The boy will be well treated, I'm assured of that. The plantation is well run, profitable. He'll have opportunities there." Ruth felt the first blow land, felt the pain of it radiate through her chest, but she kept her face neutral. Daniel, her firstborn, her serious, thoughtful boy, who loved to carve small animals from wood scraps, who asked endless questions about how things worked, who had Samuel's steady temperament and Ruth's quick mind. 9 years old, still a child, being sent to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, where he'd work from dawn to dusk in the fields, where his childhood would end and his back would learn the weight of labor and the sting of the whip. Grace will go to a family in Mobile, Thomas continued, his voice taking on a slightly defensive tone, as if he needed to justify his decisions. They need a house girl, and she's the right age to learn. It's actually a good opportunity for her. She'll be trained in household work, which is much easier than field labor. The family is respectable, well-connected. She'll be treated well. Grace, her sweet, gentle daughter, who loved to sing, who had a gift for making people smile even on the hardest days, who was just beginning to learn her letters from Ruth's careful teaching. 6 years old, being sent away to be a servant in a stranger's house, to be trained to be invisible and useful, to learn the same lessons Ruth had learned about survival and submission. The baby, Thomas paused, finally meeting Ruth's eyes, and she saw something in his expression that might have been guilt or shame or just discomfort at having to have this conversation. The baby will stay here for now, too young to be of use to anyone else. When he's older, we'll see. But for now, he stays. Baby Thomas, 14 months old, still nursing, still needing his mother. He would stay. But Ruth understood what that meant. He would stay until he was old enough to work, old enough to be sold, old enough to be taken away just like his siblings. The reprieve was temporary, a stay of execution rather than a pardon. When? Ruth asked, the single word taking all her strength to force out. Tomorrow. Christmas Day. The buyers are coming in the morning. Thomas shifted his weight, uncomfortable now, wanting to leave, wanting to be done with this scene. I'm sorry, Ruth. I know this is difficult, but it's necessary. The plantation is in trouble, and I have to do what's best for everyone. You understand that, don't you? Ruth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She understood perfectly. She understood that her children were being sold to pay for Thomas Hargrove's gambling debts. That their lives were being destroyed because a white man couldn't control his vices. That everything she'd built and fought for was being taken away because she had no power to stop it. You're a good worker, Ruth, Thomas said, his tone becoming almost friendly, as if they were having a normal conversation about normal things. Margaret values you highly. You'll continue to have a place here, and the boy will be well cared for. And who knows, perhaps in a few years, when things are better, we might be able to bring the others back. These things happen sometimes. It was a lie. And they both knew it. Children who were sold away almost never came back. Families that were separated stayed separated. But Thomas needed to tell himself this lie, needed to believe that he wasn't doing something monstrous, that he was just making a difficult business decision that would somehow work out for everyone. After he left, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking, Ruth stood in the darkness, listening to her children breathe. She didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, that they changed nothing and only made her feel weaker. Instead, she sat in the darkness, her mind working, turning over possibilities, considering options. She thought about the layout of the plantation, about the people who came and went, about the conversations she'd overheard while sewing in the corner of the parlor. She thought about the names Thomas Hargrove had mentioned over the years, business associates, gambling partners, creditors. She thought about the complex web of relationships and debts and obligations that bound these men together. She thought about the small leather journal she'd hidden beneath the floorboards, where she'd been keeping records of her own. It had started as a simple record of her children's lives, their birth dates, their first words, the small milestones she wanted to remember. But over the years, it had evolved into something else. She'd started writing down names, dates, debts, secrets, information gathered over years of being invisible, of being present in rooms where people spoke freely because they didn't consider her capable of understanding or remembering. She'd written down that Vincent Russo had won heavily from Thomas Hargrove in a faro game in October, that he'd been bragging about it to his friends, that he'd mentioned using the money to buy a new warehouse. She'd written down that Marcus Whitfield, who owned a plantation in Mississippi, was known for working his enslaved people to death and replacing them with new purchases every few years. She'd written down that James Pritchard, a shipping merchant in Mobile, had a reputation for sharp dealing and for carrying large sums of money when he traveled. She'd written down that Henry Caldwell, the slave trader who facilitated most of the sales in the region, had a weak heart and took medicine for it. She'd written down that Robert Darrow, Pritchard's business partner, had an obsessive fear of fire. She'd written down everything, not knowing why, not having a plan, just following an instinct that information was power and that someday, somehow, she might need that power. Now she knew why. Now she had a plan. By the time the sun rose on Christmas morning, Ruth had made her decision. She would let them take her children. She had no choice about that. But she would get them back. Not by begging, not by hoping for mercy from people who had none, but by methodically destroying everyone who had participated in tearing her family apart. It would take years. It would require patience, planning, and a willingness to do things that would damn her soul if she believed in damnation. But Ruth had stopped believing in a just God years ago. If there was a God, he'd abandoned people like her long before she was born. She would become what she needed to become. She would be patient like water wearing down stone, and one by one, she would cross names off her list. Christmas morning dawned cold and clear, the sky a pale blue that seemed to mock the darkness of what was about to happen. Ruth woke her children before sunrise, her hands gentle as she dressed them in their best clothes, which weren't much, just slightly less worn than their everyday garments. But she wanted them to look presentable, wanted them to have some dignity in this moment. Daniel woke quickly, his eyes alert, and Ruth saw that he understood something was wrong. He was 9 years old enough to have heard stories about children being sold away, old enough to understand what it meant when white people talked about business matters. He didn't ask questions, just stood still while Ruth buttoned his shirt and smoothed his hair, his face solemn and too old for his years. Grace was harder to wake, her body soft and warm with sleep, her face confused when Ruth pulled her from the bed. "Mama," she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Is it time for church?" "Not church, baby," Ruth said, her voice steady despite the pain threatening to tear her apart. "But we need to get you dressed. We have visitors coming today. On Christmas." Grace's face brightened slightly. "Are we having a party?" "Something like that. Come on now, let your mama fix your hair." She braided Grace's hair with careful precision, her fingers moving through the familiar motions while her mind screamed. She wanted to remember this, the feel of Grace's hair, silky and thick, the way her daughter leaned back against her, trusting and warm. She wanted to memorize the weight of her, the smell of her, the sound of her breathing. Baby Thomas was still asleep in his cradle, his thumb in his mouth, oblivious to what was coming. Ruth let him sleep. There would be time enough for him to wake up to this new reality. She made breakfast, cornmeal mush with a little molasses, a luxury she'd been saving for Christmas. The children ate quietly, Daniel picking at his food, Grace chattering about Christmas and presents and whether it might snow. Ruth couldn't eat, her stomach tight with dread, but she watched her children and tried to memorize every detail. The buyers arrived before noon, their carriages rolling up the long drive to the main house, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. Ruth watched from the window of her cabin, her hands clenched so tight her nails cut into her palms. The first buyer was a man named Marcus Whitfield, the Mississippi plantation owner. He was tall and thin with a face like a hatchet and eyes that calculated value the way a butcher calculates the worth of meat. He wore expensive clothes, a black coat with a velvet collar, polished boots, a gold watch chain visible across his vest. He looked prosperous and cold, and Ruth hated him on sight. The second buyer was a well-dressed couple from Mobile, James Pritchard and his sister Catherine. They arrived in a fine carriage with brass fittings, and Catherine wore a dress that probably cost more than Ruth would earn in a lifetime. They looked respectable, civilized, the kind of people who went to church every Sunday and considered themselves good Christians while they bought and sold human beings. Thomas Hargrove greeted them on the front steps of the main house, his manner jovial and businesslike, as if this were any normal transaction. Ruth could hear his voice carrying across the yard, talking about the weather and the journey and the quality of the merchandise he was offering. Merchandise. That's what her children were to these people. Merchandise to be inspected and evaluated and purchased. A house servant came to fetch Ruth and the children. "Master Hargrove wants you to bring them to the house," the man said, his eyes sympathetic but his voice neutral. He was older, a man named Joseph who'd been on the plantation for 30 years, and Ruth knew he'd seen the scene play out dozens of times before. Ruth nodded, unable to speak. She picked up baby Thomas, who'd woken and was fussing slightly, and took Grace's hand. Daniel walked beside her, his shoulders straight, his face carefully blank. They crossed the yard together, a small procession moving toward the main house, toward the moment when everything would change. The inspection happened in the front parlor, a room Ruth had cleaned and dusted 1,000 times, where she'd sat in the corner sewing while the Hargroves entertained their guests. Now she stood in the center of the room holding baby Thomas while strange white people examined her children like livestock. Marcus Whitfield looked at Daniel first, his hands rough as he checked the boy's teeth, felt his arms and shoulders, examined him for signs of illness or weakness. Daniel stood still through it all, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance, his face showing nothing. Ruth wanted to scream, wanted to attack this man who was touching her son, but she stood frozen, knowing that any resistance would only make things worse. "Strong boy," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the flat accent of Mississippi. "Good bone structure. Should grow into a fine field hand." "How old did you say?" 9 years, Thomas Hargrove replied. "Born in 1838. Healthy, never been sick a day in his life. Smart, too. Learns quick." "Smart can be a problem in a field hand," Whitfield said, but he was nodding, clearly satisfied. "But I can work with it. Train him right and he'll be valuable. I'll take him." Just like that. 3 sentences, and Daniel's fate was sealed. Ruth felt something inside her chest crack a little wider, but she kept her face calm, kept her breathing steady. Catherine Pritchard examined Grace next, her touch gentler but no less invasive. She checked Grace's hands, looking for signs of roughness or damage. She examined her face, her hair, her posture. She asked Grace to walk across the room, to curtsy, to speak. Grace, confused but trying to be obedient, did as she was told, her small voice answering questions about her age and her abilities. "She's lovely," Catherine said, smiling at Grace in a way that might have seemed kind if you didn't know what was happening. "And so well-mannered. You've trained her well, Ruth." Ruth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She wanted to tell this woman that Grace wasn't trained, that she was a child, that she had hopes and dreams and a right to stay with her family. But she said nothing, because words would change nothing. "We'll take her," James Pritchard said, pulling out a leather wallet. "The agreed-upon price." $800, Thomas Hargrove said. "She's worth more, but I'm willing to be reasonable given our business relationship." 800. That's what her daughter was worth. Less than a good horse, more than a piece of furniture. Ruth felt dizzy, felt the room spinning around her, but she stayed upright, stayed silent. The money changed hands. Documents were signed. And then it was time for the children to leave. Daniel was taken first, loaded into Marcus Whitfield's wagon along with 3 other children from neighboring plantations who'd also been sold. Ruth was allowed to say goodbye, a brief moment where she could hold her son one last time. She knelt down so she was at his eye level, her hands on his shoulders, and looked into his face. "Listen to me," she whispered, her voice urgent and low so only he could hear. "You be strong. You survive. No matter what happens, you survive. Can you do that for me?" Daniel nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes, Mama." "I love you," Ruth said, the words inadequate but all she had. I love you more than anything in this world. And I haven't forgotten you. I will never forget you. Do you understand? Yes, Mama. She pulled him close, holding him tight, trying to memorize the feel of him, the smell of him, with smoke and boy sweat and something indefinably him. Then she let him go because she had to, because there was no choice. She watched as he climbed into the wagon, his movements stiff and mechanical. She watched as he sat down among the other children, his face carefully blank. She watched as the wagon pulled away, rolling down the long drive toward the river road. Daniel didn't cry, but his eyes found Ruth's and held them until the wagon turned onto the main road and disappeared behind the trees. Ruth stood in the yard, baby Thomas on her hip, and felt a piece of her soul tear away and follow that wagon into the distance. Grace went next, handed over to James and Catherine Pritchard with more ceremony. Catherine fussed over her, adjusting her dress and smoothing her hair, talking about the lovely room Grace would have in their house in Mobile, about the other servants she'd meet, about the fine dresses she'd get to wear. Grace looked back at Ruth, her small face confused and frightened, clutching her cloth doll against her chest. "Mama," she called out, her voice small and scared. "Mama, are you coming too?" Ruth couldn't answer, couldn't force words past the lump in her throat. She just shook her head, and Grace's face crumpled, tears starting to stream down her cheeks. "I want to stay with you," Grace cried, struggling against Catherine Pritchard's grip. "I want my mama." "Hush now," Catherine said, her voice still kind but firm. "You'll see your mama again someday. But right now, you're coming with us. We're going to take such good care of you." Ruth watched as they loaded Grace into their fine carriage, watched as her daughter's small face appeared in the window, watched as the carriage pulled away. Grace pressed her hand against the glass, and Ruth raised her own hand in response, a silent goodbye that felt like a knife to the heart. And then they were gone. Both of them. Her children, her heart, her reason for living. Gone to places she'd never seen, to lives she couldn't imagine, to futures she couldn't control. Baby Thomas stayed behind, as promised. But Ruth knew that promise meant nothing. He'd be sold when he was older, when he could work, when he could turn a profit. The reprieve was temporary, a cruelty disguised as mercy. That night, Ruth sat in her empty cabin, baby Thomas asleep in his cradle, and opened her hidden journal. She lit a candle, the flame casting flickering shadows on the rough log walls, and began to write. She wrote down every name Thomas Hargrove had mentioned. She wrote down the names of the men who'd bought her children. She wrote down addresses, business locations, habits, and weaknesses. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the candle burned low, until she had a map of revenge that would take years to complete. She didn't know yet exactly how she would do it, but she knew she would. She would be patient like water wearing down stone. She would be invisible like she'd always been. And one by one, she would make them pay. Not for justice, Ruth had stopped believing in justice long ago, but for balance. For the simple, cold satisfaction of knowing that the men who destroyed her family would face consequences for their actions. She would become death itself, quiet and patient and inevitable. And she would not stop until every name in her journal was crossed out. 18 months passed before Ruth made her first move. During that time, she became even more invisible than before, even more useful, even more trusted. She learned that invisibility was a kind of power. People said things around her they'd never say to someone they considered a person. She learned their routines, their fears, their secrets. She became indispensable to Margaret Hargrove, the perfect servant who anticipated needs before they were spoken, who never complained, who seemed content with her lot. But beneath the surface, Ruth was gathering information, making plans, preparing for the moment when she could begin her work. Thomas Hargrove's primary creditor was a man named Vincent Russo, a cotton broker in New Orleans who'd won heavily at cards the night Thomas lost everything. Russo had a reputation for ruthlessness in business and generosity in public. He donated to churches, supported orphanages, and was frequently mentioned in the society pages of the New Orleans newspapers that sometimes made their way to the plantation. He was a pillar of the community, respected and admired, a man who seemed to have everything. He also had a mistress in the French Quarter, a fact he kept carefully hidden from his wife and business associates. Ruth learned this from Patience, who had a cousin working in a boarding house on Dauphine Street. Information traveled along invisible networks, passed between people who had to know things to survive, and Ruth had learned to tap into those networks, to ask careful questions, to piece together information from fragments of conversation. The mistress was a woman named Celeste, a free woman of color who'd been Rousseau's kept woman for 3 years. She lived in a small apartment above a bakery, and Rousseau visited her twice a week, always in the evening, always staying until late. He was generous with her, buying her clothes and jewelry, paying her rent, giving her money for expenses. But he was also careless, assuming that because she was a woman of color, she had no connections, no friends who might talk, no way to threaten his reputation. Ruth learned all of this over months of careful questioning, of listening to gossip, of piecing together a picture of Vincent Rousseau's life. She learned that he drank heavily during his visits to Celeste, that he often left his coat hanging in the downstairs hall, that he was careless with his belongings when he was drunk. She learned that he had a silver flask that he carried everywhere, engraved with his initials, that he drank from constantly throughout the day. She learned that the boarding house where Celeste lived had rats, everyone in the quarter had rats, and that the landlady kept poison in the kitchen, a white powder mixed with lard to make it palatable to rodents. Arsenic, probably, or something similar. Common enough that no one would think twice about it. In June 1849, Ruth asked Thomas Hargrove for permission to visit her sister in New Orleans. The sister didn't exist, but Thomas didn't know that, and Margaret was happy to spare Ruth for a week, since the summer sewing was finished and there were no immediate social obligations requiring new dresses. Ruth took baby Thomas with her, now a sturdy 3-year-old who'd learned to be quiet when necessary, who understood somehow that there were times when silence was important. They traveled by riverboat, a journey that took 2 days, standing on the deck among other enslaved people and poor whites, watching the brown water of the Mississippi slide past. Ruth had her freedom papers, temporary ones, allowing her to travel for a specific purpose and return by a specific date. Without them, she could be picked up as a runaway and sold. The papers were another form of control, another reminder that her freedom was always conditional, always subject to white approval. New Orleans in summer was a furnace of heat and humidity, the streets thick with the smell of the river and rotting vegetation, of cooking food and human waste, and the sweet, cloying scent of flowers. The city was loud and crowded, a chaos of languages and accents, French and English and Spanish and African dialects, all mixing together in a cacophony that was both overwhelming and oddly liberating. In the city, Ruth could disappear in a way she never could on the plantation. She was just another woman of color in a city full of them, unremarkable and unnoticed. She found the boarding house on Dauphine Street easily enough, a 3-story building with peeling paint and sagging galleries, wedged between a bakery and a tailor's shop. She watched the building for 2 days, learning the patterns of who came and went. Vincent Rousseau visited every Tuesday and Friday evening, arriving at dusk and leaving near midnight. He always came alone, always wore the same expensive coat, always carried his silver flask. Ruth didn't approach him directly. Instead, she befriended the woman who ran the boarding house, a tired-looking widow named Madame Thibodeau, who was grateful for any help she could get. Ruth offered to help with laundry in exchange for a place to sleep, and Madame Thibodeau, overwhelmed by the brutal summer heat and the endless work of running a boarding house, agreed without asking too many questions. This gave Ruth access to the building, to its rhythms, to its secrets. She learned where Madame Thibodeau kept the rat poison, in a locked cabinet in the kitchen, but the lock was old and easy to pick. She learned that Rousseau always hung his coat in the downstairs hall when he arrived, that he was usually already drunk by the time he got there, that he stumbled when he climbed the stairs to Celeste's apartment. She learned that Celeste was kind but sad, a woman who'd made the best of limited options, who accepted Rousseau's money because she had no other way to survive. Ruth felt a pang of sympathy for her, but she pushed it aside. Sympathy was a luxury she couldn't afford. On the third Friday of Ruth's stay, Russo arrived already drunk, stumbling through the door with his coat askew, his face flushed and sweating in the summer heat. He barely glanced at Ruth as she worked in the hallway, scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees. To him, she was just another enslaved woman, beneath notice, part of the background. He hung his coat on the hook as always, and Ruth saw the silver flask in the pocket, gleaming in the lamplight. He climbed the stairs to Celeste's apartment, his footsteps heavy and uneven, and Ruth heard the door close, heard the sound of voices and laughter. She waited, her heart pounding, her hands steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She waited until the house was quiet, until Madame Thibodeau had gone to bed, until the only sounds were the creaking of the old building and the distant noise of the street. Then she moved quickly and quietly, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She picked the lock on the kitchen cabinet, a skill she'd learned from Samuel, who'd learned it from another blacksmith who'd used it to steal food when he was starving. The rat poison was exactly where she'd seen Madame Thibodeau put it, a small tin with a faded label. Ruth opened it carefully, noting the white powder inside. She took a generous pinch, wrapping it in a scrap of cloth, then closed the tin and locked the cabinet again. Russo's coat still hung in the hallway, the silver flask still in the pocket. Ruth pulled it out carefully, unscrewed the cap, and added the poison. The powder dissolved easily in the whiskey, leaving no visible trace, no change in color or smell. She sealed the flask again and replaced it in the coat pocket, her movements quick and precise. Then she returned to the small room where she and baby Thomas were sleeping, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She lay down on the thin mattress, pulled Thomas close, and waited for morning. She left New Orleans the next day, baby Thomas on her hip, and returned to the Hargrove plantation. She resumed her sewing, her quiet routines, her invisible presence. She didn't think about what she'd done, didn't allow herself to feel guilt or fear. She'd made a decision, and she would live with the consequences. Vincent Russo died 4 days later. The newspapers reported it as a sudden illness, violent stomach pains, convulsions, death within hours. His doctor suspected cholera, which was common enough in New Orleans summers that no one questioned the diagnosis. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, convulsions, were similar enough to cholera that the misdiagnosis was easy and understandable. He was buried with full honors, his business associates and society friends filling the cathedral for his funeral. The newspapers praised his generosity and business acumen, his contributions to the city, his devotion to his family. His widow wept appropriately, never knowing about Celeste or the apartment on Dauphine Street or the double life her husband had led. Ruth read about it in the newspaper Thomas Hargrove left on the parlor table. She carefully cut out the obituary and pasted it in her journal next to Russo's name. Then she crossed his name out with a single, firm line. 1 down. 5 to go. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a cold, quiet sense of completion, like finishing a difficult piece of sewing. This was work, nothing more. Work that needed to be done, that she would continue to do until it was finished. The second death came in the spring of 1851, nearly 2 years after Russo's death. Ruth had learned through careful questioning and the invisible network of information that flowed between enslaved people that Marcus Whitfield was a brutal man who worked his people to exhaustion and beyond. She'd heard stories of beatings, of children worked in the fields from dawn to dusk, of punishments that left permanent scars. She'd heard that he went through enslaved workers quickly, working them to death and replacing them with new purchases, calculating that it was more profitable to extract maximum labor in a short time than to maintain a healthy workforce over years. She'd also learned, through Sarah, a woman who'd been sold from the Hargrove plantation to a neighboring property and who sometimes visited on Sundays, that Whitfield had a weakness for a particular brand of tobacco imported from Virginia. He ordered it by mail and kept it in a locked cabinet in his study, and he would fly into a rage if anyone touched it. Sarah's husband worked on the Whitfield plantation, and he'd mentioned the tobacco in passing, describing how Whitfield would smoke it every evening after supper, sitting on the veranda with a glass of whiskey, the smoke curling up into the darkening sky. Ruth began to plan. She requested permission to visit a sick aunt in Natchez, another fictional relative, but Margaret Hargrove was in a generous mood, pleased with a particularly fine dress Ruth had made for her, and she agreed. Ruth traveled by riverboat again, baby Thomas now 4 years old and learning to understand that silence was sometimes necessary for survival, that there were things his mother did that he shouldn't ask about. The Whitfield plantation was smaller than Hargrove's, only 800 acres, but the work was harder. Ruth arrived on a Sunday, the one day of rest, and asked to see her son. She'd brought a basket of Margaret Hargrove's preserves as a gift for the overseer, and she spoke with the deferential tone that white men expected, her eyes downcast, her voice soft and respectful. The overseer was a man named Briggs, with tobacco-stained teeth and suspicious eyes, a man who'd made a career out of extracting labor from human beings through fear and violence. He initially refused Ruth's request, saying that visits weren't allowed, that it would disrupt the routine. But Ruth persisted, offering the preserves, mentioning that she'd traveled all the way from Louisiana, appealing to whatever shred of humanity might exist beneath his brutal exterior. Eventually, he relented, perhaps moved by the preserves, or perhaps just tired of arguing. He allowed Ruth 1 hour with Daniel in the shade of a live oak tree near the quarters, with the understanding that she would leave immediately afterward and not cause any trouble. Daniel was 11 years old now, but he looked older. His hands were calloused and scarred. His back bore the marks of the whip. Ruth saw them when he turned, saw the raised welts and old scars that told a story of pain and punishment. His eyes held a hardness that broke Ruth's heart, a weariness that no child should have. But when he saw her, something in his face softened, and for a moment he looked like the boy she remembered. They sat together under the live oak, baby Thomas playing nearby with a stick and some pebbles, and Ruth held Daniel's scarred hands in hers. She wanted to cry, wanted to rage against the injustice of it all, but she kept her face calm, kept her voice steady. "I haven't forgotten you," she whispered, her voice low so no one else could hear. "I haven't forgotten any of you, and I'm going to make this right." Daniel looked at her with those two old eyes, eyes that had seen too much, that had learned too early how cruel the world could be. "How, Mama?" he asked, his voice flat, without hope. "You let me worry about that," Ruth said, squeezing his hands gently. "You just stay strong. Can you do that for me? No matter what happens, no matter how hard it gets, you stay strong. You survive. Promise me." He nodded slowly. "I promise." "Tell me about your life here," Ruth said, needing to know, needing to understand what her son was enduring. "Tell me everything." Daniel told her about the work, picking cotton from dawn to dusk, his hands bleeding from the sharp bowls, his back aching from bending over for hours. He told her about the overseer, about the whippings for working too slowly or not meeting the daily quota. He told her about the food, cornmeal and salt pork, never enough, always hungry. He told her about the other children, some of whom had died from fever or exhaustion or accidents in the fields. He told her about Marcus Whitfield, who would ride through the fields on his horse, watching them work, occasionally stopping to criticize or threaten or strike someone who wasn't working fast enough. He told her about the fear that permeated everything, the constant awareness that any mistake could result in punishment, that there was no safety, no respite, no hope. Ruth listened to all of it, her heart breaking with every word, her resolve hardening like steel. She memorized every detail, stored it away, added it to the ledger of crimes that needed to be answered for. When their hour was up, she held Daniel close one more time, breathing in the smell of him, sweat and cotton dust and something indefinably him that she would have recognized anywhere. "I love you," she whispered. "And I'm going to fix this. I promise you, I'm going to fix this." She spent 3 days on the Whitfield plantation, helping in the kitchen in exchange for the privilege of seeing Daniel each day. She learned the layout of the main house, the routines of the household, the location of Whitfield's study. She learned that he smoked his expensive tobacco every evening after supper, sitting on the veranda with a glass of whiskey, the ritual as predictable as sunrise. She also learned that Whitfield kept a supply of arsenic in the barn, used for killing rats and other pests. This was common on plantations. Arsenic was cheap, effective, and readily available. It was sold in general stores, kept in barns and sheds, used for everything from pest control to sheep dip. It was also, Ruth knew from her research, tasteless and odorless when mixed with other substances, and it caused symptoms that could be mistaken for many other illnesses. On her last night at the plantation, Ruth volunteered to clean the main house after supper. The housekeeper, a woman named Dinah who was exhausted from the day's work and grateful for any help, accepted. Ruth worked slowly, methodically, cleaning the parlor and the dining room, waiting until the house was quiet and the family had retired for the evening. Then she slipped into Whitfield's study, her heart pounding but her hands steady. The room smelled of tobacco and whiskey and old leather, the walls lined with books Whitfield probably never read. Inside were 6 tins of Virginia tobacco, each one carefully labeled with the brand and date of purchase. Ruth opened them one by one, mixing a small amount of arsenic into each tin, then sealing them again. The amount was carefully calculated, not enough to kill immediately, which would be suspicious, but enough to cause illness over time. Chronic arsenic poisoning looked like many other diseases: weakness, stomach problems, confusion, eventual organ failure. Doctors rarely suspected poison unless they had reason to look for it, and there would be no reason to suspect poison in a man who died slowly over months. Ruth closed the tins, locked the cabinet, and slipped out of the study. She finished cleaning the house, then returned to the quarters where she was staying. The next morning, she left the plantation, taking baby Thomas with her, and returned to the Hargrove property. She resumed her quiet life, her invisible presence, her patient waiting. Marcus Whitfield began to feel ill in late summer. At first it was just mild stomach discomfort, easy to dismiss as indigestion or something he'd eaten, but it persisted, growing worse over time. By autumn, he was experiencing severe abdominal pain, weakness, and confusion. His hands and feet began to tingle and go numb. His skin took on a grayish cast. He consulted doctors, who prescribed various treatments: bloodletting, purgatives, tonics. Nothing helped. By winter, he was bedridden, unable to work, his body wasting away. He died in February 1852, nearly a year after Ruth had poisoned his tobacco. His death was attributed to a wasting disease, possibly cancer or consumption. The doctor who attended him noted the symptoms in his records: abdominal pain, peripheral neuropathy, skin discoloration, but never suspected arsenic poisoning. Why would he? Whitfield was a wealthy plantation owner, not someone who had enemies who might want to poison him. His death was tragic, but not suspicious. Ruth learned of his death through Sarah, who heard it from her husband. She added Whitfield's obituary to her journal, a brief notice in the local newspaper noting his death and listing his survivors, and crossed out his name. 2 down. 4 to go. She thought about Daniel, still on the Whitfield plantation, now under new ownership. She'd learned that the plantation had been sold to pay Whitfield's debts, the enslaved people sold along with the land. Daniel had been purchased by a man named Henderson, who owned a smaller plantation nearby. Ruth didn't know if Henderson was better or worse than Whitfield, but at least Whitfield was gone. At least the men who'd worked her son like an animal, who'd scarred his back with a whip, who'd treated him as less than human, that man was dead. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Time moved differently for Ruth after that. Each day was the same: sewing, cooking, caring for baby Thomas, who was growing into a quiet, watchful child who asked few questions and learned to read the moods of the white people around him. But beneath the surface, Ruth was always planning, always gathering information, always preparing for the next move. She learned patience on a level she'd never imagined possible. Months would pass between opportunities, years between actions, but she never forgot, never wavered, never lost sight of her goal. The journal hidden beneath the floorboards of her cabin became her Bible, the names written there are scripture. She would read them at night by candlelight, memorizing every detail, adding new information as she learned it, refining her plans. She also began teaching Thomas to read and write, using stolen books from the Hargrove Library, teaching him at night when no one could see. It was dangerous. Enslaved people caught reading could be punished severely. But Ruth was careful, and Thomas was a quick learner. She taught him not just letters and words, but also how to think, how to observe, how to understand the world around him. Words are weapons, she told him, repeating her mother's words. Information is power. You remember that. You watch, you listen, you learn, and you never let them know how much you understand. Thomas nodded, his young face serious, and Ruth saw in him the same quiet determination that had sustained her through years of loss and pain. He was Samuel's son, with his father's steady temperament and strong hands. But he was also her son, with her quick mind and patient fury. The third death came in 1853, 5 years after the Christmas Eve separation. James Pritchard was the man who'd bought Grace, sending her to Mobile to work as a housegirl for his sister's family. Ruth had learned through her network of information that Pritchard was a shipping merchant who traveled frequently between Mobile and New Orleans, conducting business along the Gulf Coast. He was known for his sharp dealing and his habit of carrying large sums of money when he traveled, trusting in his reputation and his connections to keep him safe. He was also known for his predictable routes and his tendency to travel alone, preferring to drive his own carriage rather than hire a driver. This was unusual for a man of his wealth, but Pritchard prided himself on his independence and his ability to handle his own affairs. Ruth saved every penny she could, hiding coins in the hem of her dress, in the lining of her shoes, in the hollow of a tree near the quarters. It took her a year to save enough for what she needed, money for travel, for bribes, for the materials she would need. She was patient, methodical, never taking so much that it would be noticed, never spending anything that might raise questions. In the autumn of 1853, she requested permission to visit her fictional sick aunt again, this time in Mobile. Margaret Hargrove was less generous this time. Ruth was too valuable to spare for long, and Margaret had grown dependent on her skills. But Thomas Hargrove, feeling guilty about something Ruth didn't know and didn't care about, overruled his wife. Ruth could go for 3 days, no more. Mobile in autumn was beautiful, the air finally cooling after the brutal summer heat, the sky a clear, brilliant blue. The city sat on the bay, a busy port with ships coming and going, their masts like a forest of bare trees against the sky. Ruth found the house where Grace was working, a modest townhouse near the waterfront owned by Catherine Pritchard, James's sister. She waited across the street, hidden in the shadow of a building, watching. She saw servants come and go, saw Catherine Pritchard leave for a social call, saw the routines of the household play out, and then, in the late afternoon, she saw a small figure emerge from the servants' entrance to empty the washwater. Grace. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. Her daughter was 10 years old now, thin and serious-faced, her hair pulled back in a tight braid. She wore a simple dress, too large for her, and her movements were quick and efficient, the movements of someone who'd learned to work fast to avoid punishment. She emptied the water into the street, then turned to go back inside, and Ruth saw her face clearly for the first time in 5 years. She looked like Samuel. She had his strong jaw, his steady eyes, his way of holding himself with quiet dignity despite everything. But she also looked tired, older than her years, with shadows under her eyes and a thinness that spoke of not quite enough food, not quite enough rest. Ruth wanted to call out, wanted to run across the street and hold her daughter, wanted to take her away from this place and never let her go. But she couldn't. Any contact would be dangerous, would raise questions, would potentially make things worse for Grace. So Ruth stayed in the shadows, memorizing her daughter's face, storing it away like treasure. Then she turned her attention to James Pritchard. He arrived at his sister's house that evening, his carriage loaded with goods from New Orleans, crates and boxes that servants unloaded and carried inside. Ruth watched from her hiding place as he climbed down from the driver's seat, a tall man in his 40s with graying hair and an air of prosperity. He laughed and joked with his sister, his voice carrying across the street. And Ruth hated him with a cold, pure hatred that burned like ice. This was the man who'd bought her daughter. This was the man who'd examined Grace like livestock, who'd paid $800 for the right to own her, who'd taken her away from her family and put her to work in his sister's house. This was the man who saw nothing wrong with any of it, who probably considered himself a good Christian, who went to church every Sunday and never questioned the system that gave him power over other human beings. Ruth followed him when he left, keeping to the darkness, learning his route. The streets of Mobile were poorly lit, and there were stretches where the road ran along the waterfront, isolated and dark, with warehouses on one side and the bay on the other. Ruth noted these locations, filed them away, began to form a plan. She spent the next day gathering what she needed. She stole men's clothing from a washing line, rough trousers and a shirt, a cap to hide her hair. She stole a heavy iron bar from the docks, the kind used to secure cargo on ships, small enough to hide but heavy enough to be effective. She stole chains, also from the docks, lengths of heavy iron that would weigh down a body and keep it from floating. On her last night in Mobile, she was waiting in one of those dark stretches along the waterfront, dressed in the stolen men's clothing, her face covered with a scarf, her hair hidden under the cap. She looked like a dock worker or a sailor, just another rough man in a city full of them. When Pritchard's carriage approached, she stepped into the road, holding up a hand as if in distress, making sounds of panic but no words. Pritchard, to his credit, stopped. He was a businessman, but he wasn't entirely heartless, and someone appearing to be in distress on a dark road was cause for concern. "What's wrong?" he called down from the driver's seat, his voice carrying a note of irritation mixed with concern. Ruth gestured frantically toward the waterfront, toward the dock pilings that created deep shadows, making sounds of distress but no coherent words. Pritchard hesitated, clearly torn between caution and curiosity, then climbed down from the carriage. He tied the reins to a post and walked toward Ruth, peering into the darkness. "Where's the problem?" he asked, irritation growing in his voice. "I don't see anything." Ruth pointed toward the water's edge, where the dock pilings created pools of shadow so deep they looked solid. Pritchard walked closer, and Ruth followed, her hand slipping into the pocket of her stolen coat, where she'd hidden the iron bar. What happened next was quick and brutal. Ruth had never killed anyone with her own hands before. The previous deaths had been accomplished through poison, through patience, through methods that kept her at a distance from the actual moment of death. But this was different. This required her to be present, to be physical, to feel the impact of metal on bone, to hear the sound of a man dying. She hit him from behind, the iron bar connecting with the back of his skull with a sound like a melon splitting. Pritchard went down without a sound, his body crumpling to the ground. Ruth hit him again and again, making sure, her breath coming fast, her heart pounding. Then she wrapped the chains around his body, working quickly, her hands shaking but efficient. She rolled him to the edge of the dock and pushed him into the water. The splash was louder than she'd expected, and she froze, listening for any sign that someone had heard. But the waterfront was quiet, the nearest warehouse dark and empty, and after a moment, Ruth allowed herself to breathe again. Pritchard's body sank quickly, pulled down by the weight of the chains. The current was strong here, pulling toward the bay, and Ruth knew that even if the body surfaced, it would be miles away, bloated and unrecognizable. Just another drowning in a port city where drownings were common enough. She returned to the place where she'd hidden her own clothes, changed quickly, and buried the stolen clothing and the iron bar in the mud near the waterfront. Then she walked back to the boarding house where she was staying, her legs shaking, her hands still trembling with adrenaline and fear. She'd killed a man, not with poison, not at a distance, but with her own hands, feeling the impact, hearing the sound, seeing the body fall. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had become something she'd never imagined becoming. But when she thought of Grace, of her daughter's thin face and tired eyes, of the years of servitude stretching ahead of her, Ruth felt no regret, only a cold satisfaction and a determination to continue. She returned to the Hargrove plantation 2 days later, resuming her quiet life, her invisible presence. She told Margaret that her aunt had died, and Margaret expressed perfunctory sympathy before handing Ruth a pile of mending. James Pritchard was reported missing a week later. His carriage was found abandoned near the waterfront, his money and goods gone. The authorities assumed robbery, probably by one of the rough men who worked the docks or one of the sailors who passed through the port. Mobile was a busy city full of transients and criminals, and robberies weren't uncommon. The case was investigated briefly, then filed away as unsolved. Ruth added a newspaper clipping to her journal, a brief article about Pritchard's disappearance, noting that he was presumed dead, and crossed out his name. 3 down. 3 to go. She thought about Grace, still in Catherine Pritchard's house, now under the uncertain future that Pritchard's death had created. She'd learned later that Catherine had kept Grace, had continued to use her as a house servant. But Ruth didn't know if that was better or worse. At least Pritchard was gone. At least the men who'd bought her daughter, who'd taken her away, who'd treated her as property, that man was dead. It still wasn't enough, but it was progress. The 4th and 5th deaths required more patience, more planning, more careful execution. Ruth was getting older now, approaching 40, which was old for someone who'd lived her life, who'd endured what she'd endured. Her hands were starting to show the signs of age, the joints sometimes aching in cold weather, her eyes needing more light for close work, but her mind was as sharp as ever, her determination undiminished, her patience as deep as the ocean. Baby Thomas was growing into a young man, quiet and intelligent, learning to read from the books Ruth stole from the Hargrove library. She taught him at night by candlelight, the same way her mother had taught her. She taught him letters and numbers, history and geography, everything she could glean from the books she borrowed and returned before they were missed. Words are weapons, she told him, repeating the lesson she'd learned from her own mother. Information is power. You watch, you listen, you learn, and you remember everything, because you never know when you'll need it. Thomas nodded, his young face serious, his eyes reflecting the candlelight. He was 12 now, old enough to understand that his mother was doing something dangerous, old enough to keep secrets, old enough to help in small ways. He would watch the main house, would report on conversations he overheard, would help Ruth gather the information she needed. The 4th target was Henry Caldwell, the man who'd facilitated the sales of Ruth's children, acting as Thomas Hargrove's agent in the transactions. Caldwell was a slave trader based in Natchez, a man who made his living separating families and calculating human worth in dollars and cents. He had an office near the river with barred windows and a sign advertising Negro sales and purchases. And he was known throughout the region as someone who could move enslaved people quickly and efficiently, who had connections to buyers across the South, who could turn human beings into profit with minimal fuss. Ruth had learned that he suffered from a weak heart. He'd mentioned it once when visiting the Hargrove plantation, complaining about chest pains and shortness of breath, asking Margaret if she had any remedies. Margaret had suggested various tonics and teas, and Caldwell had nodded gratefully, mentioning that his doctor had prescribed something similar. Ruth had filed this information away, adding it to her journal, knowing that someday it might be useful. Now, years later, she retrieved that information and began to build a plan around it. She learned, through careful questioning, asking Sarah, who asked her husband, who asked someone else in the invisible network of information that connected enslaved people across plantations and cities, that Caldwell took a tonic for his heart condition. It was a mixture of digitalis and other herbs prescribed by his doctor in Natchez, and he kept the bottle in his coat pocket and took a dose every morning and evening, regular as clockwork. Digitalis was a powerful medicine derived from the foxglove plant, used to treat heart conditions. In the right dose, it could regulate an irregular heartbeat, could strengthen a weak heart, could extend a person's life. But in the wrong dose, it could stop a heart entirely, could cause death that looked exactly like the heart failure it was meant to prevent. In 1855, Ruth requested permission to travel to Natchez to purchase fabric for Margaret Hargrove's new dresses. This was a reasonable request. Natchez had better shops than the small towns near the plantation, and Margaret was planning a series of social events that would require new clothing. Margaret agreed, even giving Ruth money for the purchases, trusting her to select appropriate fabrics and negotiate fair prices. Ruth traveled by riverboat, a journey she'd made several times now, standing on the deck among other travelers, watching the river slide past. She carried her temporary freedom papers, the document that allowed her to travel but reminded her constantly that her freedom was conditional, subject to white approval, revocable at any moment. Natchez sat on a bluff above the river, a prosperous city built on cotton and slavery, with grand mansions overlooking the water and a bustling commercial district near the docks. Ruth found Caldwell's office easily enough, a brick building near the river with barred windows and that sign advertising his business. The sight of it made her stomach turn, made her think of all the families that had been destroyed in that building, all the children sold away from their parents, all the lives reduced to entries in a ledger. She watched the building for 2 days, learning Caldwell's routines. He arrived at 8 in the morning, left for lunch at noon, returned at 1, and departed for home at 5. He was a creature of habit, predictable and methodical, which made him vulnerable. On the 3rd day, Ruth entered the office claiming to have a message from Thomas Hargrove. Caldwell's clerk, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually worried expression, told her to wait. She sat on a hard bench in the corner, invisible as always, unwatched. The office smelled of ink and paper and something else, something Ruth couldn't quite identify but that made her skin crawl. Fear, maybe. Despair. The accumulated grief of all the people who'd passed through this place on their way to being sold. Caldwell emerged from his private office at noon, pulling on his coat, preparing to leave for lunch. He was a portly man in his 50s with thinning hair and a florid complexion, dressed in expensive clothes that strained across his belly. He reached into his coat pocket, withdrew a small brown bottle, and took a drink, his face screwing up slightly at the taste. Then he replaced the bottle and left for lunch, the door closing behind him with a jingle of bells. Ruth waited until the clerk left for his own lunch. He always left 5 minutes after Caldwell, locking the door behind him but leaving the office unattended for the hour they were both gone. This was Ruth's opportunity, the window she'd been waiting for. She'd brought her own bottle, identical to Caldwell's, purchased from an apothecary in New Orleans during one of her previous trips. She'd filled it with a mixture that looked and tasted like his tonic, digitalis and herbs and alcohol, but contained 10 times the normal dose of digitalis. Too much digitalis would overstimulate a weak heart, would cause it to beat irregularly, would eventually stop it entirely. Ruth moved quickly once the clerk was gone. She slipped into Caldwell's private office, her heart pounding, her hands steady despite her fear. The office was larger than she'd expected, with a desk covered in papers and ledgers, shelves lined with more ledgers, a safe in the corner. Caldwell's coat hung on a hook near the door, and Ruth could see the brown bottle in the pocket. She switched the bottles, leaving the poisoned one in Caldwell's coat pocket, taking the real one with her. The entire operation took less than a minute, and then Ruth was back on her bench in the corner, her face calm, her breathing steady as if she'd never moved. The clerk returned first, then Caldwell, who nodded at Ruth absently and disappeared back into his office. Ruth waited a few more minutes, then left, claiming that she'd deliver the message another time since Mr. Caldwell seemed busy. She spent the rest of the day purchasing fabric for Margaret, selecting patterns and colors, negotiating prices, playing the role of the trusted servant on an errand. Then she returned to the riverboat and traveled back to the Hargrove plantation, the poison tonic safely hidden in her bag. Henry Caldwell died that evening, collapsing at his dinner table after taking his evening dose of tonic. His wife screamed, his children panicked, and a doctor was summoned. But there was nothing to be done. Caldwell's heart had stopped suddenly and completely, and he was dead before the doctor arrived. The doctor ruled it heart failure, which was true enough. Caldwell had a weak heart, everyone knew that, and heart failure was a common cause of death for men his age. No one suspected the tonic, which was discarded after his death as no longer needed. No one thought to test it, to check if the dosage was correct, to question whether someone might have tampered with it. Ruth learned of his death through the newspapers, through the invisible network of information that connected enslaved people across the region. She added his obituary to her journal and crossed out his name. 4 down. 2 to go. She thought about all the families Caldwell had separated, all the children he'd sold, all the lives he'd destroyed in pursuit of profit. She thought about how he'd facilitated the sale of Daniel and Grace, how he'd calculated their worth in dollars and cents, how he'd treated them as commodities rather than human beings. His death didn't undo any of that. It didn't bring back the families he'd destroyed, didn't heal the wounds he'd inflicted, but it meant he couldn't hurt anyone else. It meant one less monster in the world. It still wasn't enough. But Ruth was patient. She had 2 more names in her journal, and she would cross them out one by one until the work was done. The 5th death was the hardest, because it required Ruth to return to New Orleans and face the men who'd bought Grace after James Pritchard's disappearance. His name was Robert Darrow, and he was Catherine Pritchard's business partner, having taken over James Pritchard's shipping interests after Pritchard's disappearance. Darrow had arranged for Grace to be transferred to his own household in New Orleans after Catherine Pritchard died in 1856, and Ruth had learned through her network of information that he had a reputation for cruelty that made even other slaveholders uncomfortable. She'd heard stories of beatings, of punishments that went beyond what was considered acceptable even in a system built on violence, of enslaved people who'd tried to run away and been caught and made examples of. She'd heard that Darrow enjoyed inflicting pain, that he saw it as a way of maintaining control, that he believed fear was the most effective tool for managing his property. Ruth thought about Grace in that house, subject to that man's cruelty, and her determination hardened into something cold and implacable. Darrow had to die, and his death had to be thorough, final, absolute. She also learned that Darrow had a particular fear: fire. His father had died in a warehouse fire when Darrow was a child, trapped inside when the building collapsed, and Darrow had developed an obsessive fear of flames. As a result, he kept multiple fire buckets in every room of his house, checked the fireplaces constantly, forbade candles in the upper floors, and would wake in the night to make sure no fires had started. It was a well-known quirk, something his business associates joked about, something his household staff had learned to accommodate. Ruth filed this information away, recognizing it as a weakness, a vulnerability that could be exploited. In 1857, Ruth made her final trip to New Orleans. Thomas was 14 now, old enough to be left alone, old enough to understand what his mother was doing, even though she never spoke of it directly. Before she left, she held him close, breathing in the smell of him, wood smoke and young man's sweat and something indefinably him. "I'll be back," she told him, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "And when I come back, things are going to change. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded, his young face serious, his eyes reflecting a maturity beyond his years. "I understand, Mama. Be careful." "I'm always careful," Ruth said. And it was true. She'd been careful for years, patient and methodical, never taking unnecessary risks, never acting without a plan. But this time felt different, more dangerous, more final. She arrived in New Orleans in late summer, when the heat made everyone careless and tired, when the city smelled of rotting vegetation and human waste and the sweet, cloying scent of flowers. She found work in a boarding house near Darrow's home, the same strategy she'd used years before with Vincent Russo, offering to help with laundry and cleaning in exchange for a place to sleep. Darrow's house was a 3-story townhouse in the Garden District, built of wood with elaborate ironwork balconies, painted a pale yellow that had faded in the harsh sun. It was beautiful, and Ruth noted with cold satisfaction, highly flammable. The ground floor housed Darrow's office and a formal parlor, the second floor contained the family's living quarters, the third floor was servants' quarters and storage. Ruth watched the house for weeks, learning its rhythms, its vulnerabilities. She learned that Darrow kept his business records in his office, including documents related to his slave purchases and sales, ledgers that recorded the names and prices of human beings as if they were livestock. She learned that he worked late into the night, often falling asleep at his desk, his body heavy with whiskey and exhaustion. She learned that the household staff was reduced at night, with only a single enslaved man keeping watch downstairs, and that man often fell asleep in his chair, exhausted from the day's work. She also managed to see Grace briefly, when the girl was sent on an errand to the market. Grace was 14 now, no longer a child, but not quite a woman. Tall and beautiful, with her mother's eyes and her father's strong jaw. She moved through the market with quick efficiency, her face carefully blank, her eyes downcast, the posture of someone who'd learned to be invisible. Ruth watched from a distance, her heart aching with love and grief and rage. She wanted to call out, wanted to run to her daughter, wanted to take her away from this place and never let her go. But she couldn't risk it. Any contact would be dangerous, would potentially make things worse for Grace. So Ruth stayed hidden, memorizing her daughter's face, storing it away like treasure, and continued with her plan. On a hot September night, when the air was thick and still, when the city seemed to be holding its breath, Ruth entered Darrow's house through the servants' entrance. She'd stolen a key weeks earlier, making a wax impression and having a copy made by a blacksmith who didn't ask questions, who took her money and handed over the key without meeting her eyes. She moved through the dark house like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors, her breathing steady despite the fear that made her heart pound. She climbed the stairs to the third floor, to the storage room where she knew she'd find what she needed: old rags, turpentine, lamp oil, the materials of fire, innocent on their own but deadly in combination. Ruth soaked the rags in the flammable liquids, her hands working quickly and efficiently, and placed them carefully throughout the third floor, in corners and closets where they wouldn't be immediately noticed, near wooden beams and under eaves where the fire would spread quickly. Then she descended to the second floor and did the same, working quickly and quietly, her ears straining for any sound of discovery. But the house was silent except for the creaking of old wood and the distant sound of someone snoring. She saved the office for last. Darrow was there as expected, slumped over his desk in a whiskey-induced sleep, his face slack, his breathing heavy. Papers were scattered across the desk, business records, ledgers, letters. Ruth could see her daughter's name in one of the ledgers, along with a price and a date of purchase, and her rage flared hot and bright. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at this man who'd owned her daughter, who'd had the power to hurt her, to sell her, to destroy her future. This man who'd built his wealth on the suffering of others, who'd never questioned his right to own human beings, who'd probably considered himself a good Christian and a respectable member of society. Ruth felt no pity, only a cold, implacable determination to see this through. She placed the final rags around the office, soaking them thoroughly with lamp oil and turpentine, creating a trail that would carry the fire from one spot to another. Then she struck a match, the small flame bright in the darkness, and touched it to the nearest rag. The fire caught immediately, racing along the trail of oil, spreading faster than Ruth had anticipated. She ran, her heart pounding, escaping through the servants' entrance as smoke began to fill the house. Behind her, she heard the crackle of flames, the sound of breaking glass, and then, finally, screams. She didn't look back. She ran through the dark streets, her lungs burning, her legs shaking, until she was far enough away to slow down, to catch her breath, to blend into the shadows. The fire consumed Darrow's house entirely, the flames visible from across the city, a pillar of fire and smoke that lit up the night sky. People came running from nearby houses, forming bucket brigades, trying to stop the fire from spreading to neighboring buildings. But Darrow's house was already lost, the flames too hot, too fierce, too all-consuming. Darrow died in his office, overcome by smoke before he could escape. His body was found later in the ruins, charred beyond recognition. Several others died as well, servants who'd been sleeping on the third floor, trapped by the flames, unable to escape. Ruth learned their names later, added them to the weight of guilt she carried, but she didn't regret what she'd done. They were casualties of a war she hadn't started, victims of a system that had made their deaths possible. Grace survived. She'd been sleeping in a small room on the ground floor, and she escaped through a window when the smoke woke her, her survival instincts sharp after years of learning to be alert to danger. Ruth watched from a distance as Grace stood in the street, wrapped in a blanket someone had given her, watching her prison burn. Ruth left New Orleans the next morning, before the authorities could start asking questions, before anyone could connect her to the fire. She traveled by riverboat back to Louisiana, standing on the deck among other travelers, watching the river slide past, feeling the weight of what she'd done settling into her bones. She'd killed multiple people this time, not just her target, but also innocent servants who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had become something she'd never imagined becoming. But when she thought of Grace, of her daughter's survival, of the fact that Darrow could never hurt her again, Ruth felt no regret. Only a cold satisfaction and a determination to finish what she'd started. She crossed out Darrow's name in her journal. 5 down. 1 to go. The last name in Ruth's journal was the one that had started everything, Thomas Hargrove. He was older now, in his mid-40s, his hair graying at the temples, his face showing the effects of years of drinking and gambling. His debts were somewhat under control, the sales of Ruth's children had bought him time, had allowed him to pay off his most pressing creditors, but his character was unchanged. He still saw the people he enslaved as property, still made decisions about their lives with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never questioned his right to do so. Ruth had waited years for this moment, planning carefully, considering every angle. She couldn't be obvious. She still lived on his property, still depended on his household for survival, still needed to maintain her cover as the perfect, invisible servant. But she also knew his weaknesses, his habits, his secrets. She'd been watching him for years, gathering information, waiting for the right opportunity. She knew, for instance, that he'd been having chest pains similar to Henry Caldwell's. She'd overheard him complaining to Margaret about tightness in his chest, about shortness of breath, about feeling tired all the time. She'd heard Margaret urge him to see a doctor, and she'd learned that he'd consulted a physician in New Orleans who'd prescribed a tonic similar to Caldwell's, digitalis and herbs, to be taken twice daily. She knew that he kept the bottle in his desk drawer and took a dose every evening before bed, regular as clockwork. She knew that Margaret had grown tired of his gambling, his absences, his failures, that she'd been corresponding with a cousin in Charleston, discussing the possibility of leaving Thomas and returning to her family. She knew that if Thomas died, Margaret would inherit the plantation and would likely sell it, freeing herself from a life she'd grown to hate. Ruth also knew that Margaret, in her correspondence with her Charleston cousin, had mentioned the possibility of freeing some of the enslaved people who'd served the household for decades, as a gesture of Christian charity and to ease her conscience. Ruth had read these letters, had steamed them open, read them, and resealed them, a skill she'd learned over years of gathering information, and she knew that her name was on that list. Freedom. The word tasted strange in Ruth's mouth, foreign and almost incomprehensible after so many years of bondage. But it was possible, if Thomas died, if Margaret followed through on her plans. It was a future Ruth had stopped allowing herself to imagine. But now it was within reach. In the spring of 1858, Ruth made her final move. It was simple, almost elegant in its simplicity, a repetition of the method she'd used on Henry Caldwell. She switched Thomas Hargrove's tonic with a poison version, the same mixture she'd used before, digitalis in a dose 10 times stronger than prescribed, enough to stop a weak heart entirely. She did it on a Tuesday evening while Thomas was at dinner and the study was empty. She moved quickly and quietly, her hands steady despite the significance of what she was doing. This was the last name, the final act, the end of a journey that had taken nearly 11 years. She switched the bottles, leaving the poisoned one in Thomas's desk drawer, taking the real one with her. Then she returned to her cabin, her heart pounding, her hands shaking with adrenaline and fear and something that might have been triumph. Thomas Hargrove died on a Thursday evening in May, collapsing in his study after taking his evening dose of tonic. Margaret found him an hour later, slumped in his chair, his face gray, his eyes staring at nothing. She screamed for help, and servants came running, but there was nothing to be done. Thomas was dead, his weak heart finally giving out, his body worn down by years of drinking and stress and poor health. The doctor ruled it heart failure, which surprised no one. Thomas had been showing signs of poor health for months, had been complaining of chest pains and fatigue, had been prescribed medicine for his condition. His death was tragic but not unexpected, the natural result of a life lived without moderation or care. Margaret wept appropriately at the funeral, standing beside the grave in her black dress, her daughters on either side of her, accepting condolences from neighbors and business associates. Ruth stood in the back among the other enslaved people from the plantation, her face composed, her hands folded, showing nothing of what she felt. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a cold, quiet sense of completion, like finishing a difficult piece of sewing. This was work, nothing more, work that had taken 11 years, that had required patience and planning and a willingness to become something she'd never imagined becoming. She crossed out the final name in her journal that night, sitting in her cabin by candlelight, her hand steady as she drew the line through Thomas Hargrove's name. Then she closed the journal and sat in the darkness, listening to Thomas, her son, now 15 years old, breathing in his sleep. It was done. All of them were dead. Every man who'd participated in tearing her family apart. Every man who'd profited from her children's suffering. Every man who'd treated human beings as property to be bought and sold. They were all gone. And Ruth had been the instrument of their destruction. She should have felt something, triumph, satisfaction, relief. But she felt only emptiness, a hollow place where a rage had been, and a bone-deep exhaustion that made her feel ancient. Margaret Hargrove sold the plantation 6 months after Thomas's death, just as Ruth had predicted. She returned to Charleston with her daughters, eager to leave behind the memories of a failed marriage and a life she'd never wanted. As part of the sale, and following through on the plans she'd mentioned in her letters, she freed several of the enslaved people who'd served the household for decades. Ruth was among them. She received her freedom papers on a cold December morning, nearly 11 years after the Christmas Eve when her family had been torn apart. She was 43 years old, her hands showing the signs of age, her hair threaded with gray, but her mind was as sharp as ever. Thomas, her son, not the dead master, was 15, tall and strong, with his father's shoulders and his mother's intelligence. They left Louisiana together, traveling north to Philadelphia, where Ruth had heard there were communities of free black people who might help them start over. The journey was long and difficult, traveling by riverboat and then by train, always careful to keep their freedom papers close, always aware that their freedom was fragile, subject to challenge, that they could be kidnapped and sold back into slavery if they weren't careful. But they made it, arriving in Philadelphia in the spring of 1859, 2 free people in a city that was still dangerous for black people but offered more possibilities than the South ever could. Ruth never told Thomas what she'd done. She never told anyone. The journal she'd kept for so many years was burned page by page in a fireplace in a boarding house in Philadelphia. She watched the pages curl and blacken, watched the names and dates and careful records of revenge turn to ash, and felt a weight lift from her shoulders. But Ruth did try to find her other children. She placed advertisements in newspapers, contacted churches and aid societies, followed every lead, no matter how faint. She wrote letters to people who might have information, traveled to cities where she'd heard rumors, spent what little money she had on the search. She never found Daniel. She learned years later, from a man who'd been enslaved on the Whitfield plantation, that Daniel had died of fever in 1854, just 2 years after Marcus Whitfield's death. He'd been 11 years old, still a child, worked to death in the cotton fields of Mississippi. The news broke something in Ruth that had somehow survived everything else, and she wept for the first time in years, grieving for the son she'd lost, for the boy who'd never had a chance to be free. She never learned what happened to Grace after the fire in New Orleans. The trail went cold, and despite years of searching, despite advertisements and letters and inquiries, Ruth never saw her daughter again. She didn't know if Grace had been sold again, or if she'd escaped in the chaos after the fire, or if she'd died. The not knowing was its own kind of torture, worse in some ways than knowing for certain. Ruth lived the rest of her life in Philadelphia, working as a seamstress. Her skills with needle and thread provided a modest living. She attended church, became part of a community of free black people who supported each other, who helped new arrivals from the South, who worked together to survive in a city that was better than the South but still far from welcoming. She never remarried. Samuel had been her husband, the love of her life, and no one could replace him. She'd learned through her network of information that he died in 1856, his heart giving out while he worked at the forge on the Pritchard plantation. She grieved for him quietly, privately, adding his loss to the weight of grief she carried. She never spoke of the years on the Hargrove plantation, or the Christmas Eve when her family was torn apart, or the 11 years she'd spent methodically destroying the men responsible. When people asked about her past, she'd say only that she'd been enslaved in Louisiana and had been freed when her master died. She never mentioned the journal or the names or the careful, patient revenge that had consumed years of her life. But sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she'd think about those men. Vincent Russo, dying in agony from arsenic poisoning. Marcus Whitfield, wasting away from chronic poisoning, his body failing bit by bit. James Pritchard, his body sinking into the bay, weighted down with chains. Henry Caldwell, his weak heart finally giving out. Robert Darrow, burning in the fire that consumed his house. Thomas Hargrove, collapsing in his study, his heart stopped by the medicine that was supposed to save him. She'd think about them, and she'd feel no regret, only a cold satisfaction and a sense that she'd done what needed to be done, that she'd brought some measure of balance to a world that was fundamentally unjust. Ruth died in 1872 at the age of 57, surrounded by friends and her son Thomas, who'd become a teacher and a community leader, who'd married and had children of his own, who'd built a life that his mother had made possible through her sacrifice and her terrible, patient fury. At her funeral, people spoke of her kindness, her generosity, her quiet strength. They talked about how she'd helped new arrivals from the South, how she'd taught children to read and write, how she'd been a pillar of the community. No one knew about the journal or the names or the careful, patient revenge that had consumed years of her life. But Thomas knew. He'd never asked, had never wanted to know the details, but he'd understood on some level what his mother had done in those years between separation and freedom. He'd seen the cold determination in her eyes, had watched her gather information and make plans, had known that she was working towards something. Sometimes, late at night, he'd remember his mother's face on that Christmas Eve in 1847, when she'd held him close and whispered promises. He'd remember the cold determination in her eyes, the way she'd looked at the men who'd taken his siblings away, and he'd wonder, though he never asked, what his mother had done in those years between separation and freedom. Some questions, he decided, were better left unanswered. Some truths were too heavy to bear, too dark to speak aloud. His mother had done what she'd needed to do to survive, to protect what remained of her family, to bring some measure of justice to a world that offered none. And that, Thomas decided, was enough. It had to be enough. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there darker secrets still buried in those courthouse records and family whispers? Did Ruth's revenge bring her peace, or did it only add to the weight of grief she carried? Leave your comment below with your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, stories that make you question what really happened in the shadows of history, stories about people who fought back against impossible odds, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries and dark historical tales. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another story that time tried to forget.